It was a sunny afternoon in Miami when 17-year-old Maya Johnson was driving home from work. She had just finished her shift at the local diner and was heading back to her apartment. The streets were bustling with cars and people, but Maya felt safe. Her old car was her pride and joy, and it was the only thing she owned that truly felt like hers. As she drove through a quiet intersection, she noticed a police car pull up behind her. Maya wasn't sure why she was being followed, but she assumed it was nothing. Maybe she had made an illegal turn or something, but she didn't think it was serious. The lights on the police car blinked, and she pulled over to the side of the road. When Maya rolled down her window, she was met with the sharp voice of Officer Roberts. He looked stern, his expression unreadable. He asked her for her license and registration, and she quickly handed them over. But as he looked at the papers, something seemed off. Officer Roberts stared at the documents for a long moment before raising an eyebrow. "Where did you get this car, miss?" he asked, his tone suddenly colder. Maya, confused, replied, "I bought it from a used car dealership a few months ago. I have the papers right here." He glanced at her suspiciously, his eyes narrowed. "This doesn't look right. This car doesn't belong to you. Where's the owner?" Maya felt a pit form in her stomach. She had all the right paperwork. Everything was legal. "Sir, I have the title and proof of purchase. Everything's in order." But Officer Roberts wasn't convinced. "I don't believe you. This car's been flagged for suspicion." He didn't explain how or why, just that it didn't seem right. Before Maya could explain, he reached into the car and grabbed the keys from the ignition, holding them up like a trophy. "I'm confiscating this car," he said firmly. Maya's heart raced. "What? You can't just take my car. I need it to get home." Officer Roberts was unmoved. "You'll have to get someone to pick you up. You're not driving this car anywhere." Maya couldn't believe what was happening. She had never been in trouble with the law before. She thought back to the countless times she had seen police officers in the community, making sure everything was okay. She thought they were supposed to protect people. But this officer wasn't acting like that at all. "Sir, this isn't fair," Maya protested. "I have every right to be driving this car. Please, just check the papers." But Officer Roberts didn't listen. He waved off her plea and walked toward his police car, leaving Maya standing on the side of the road. He didn't explain anything else to her, and Maya didn't know what to do. She stood there, feeling helpless and frustrated. The whole situation didn't feel right. She had done nothing wrong, but it felt like the officer was treating her differently because of something she couldn't control. As he drove away with her car in tow, Maya took a deep breath. She had to figure out what to do next. Little did she know, this moment would change everything. She was about to begin a journey she never expected, one that would force her to stand up for herself and her rights in ways she couldn't have imagined. When Maya got home that evening, she was still in shock. Her mind kept replaying the scene. Officer Roberts taking her car without any clear reason. She could hardly believe it was happening to her. Maya had always been taught that if she followed the rules and worked hard, she would be fine. But today felt different. It wasn't just about the car. It was something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, was already home when Maya walked through the door. She had heard the frustration in Maya's voice on the phone earlier, but now seeing her daughter standing there, her face pale, Mrs. Johnson could tell something was very wrong. "What happened, Maya?" her mother asked, her voice full of concern. Maya sat down at the kitchen table, still shaking. She explained everything: how Officer Roberts had pulled her over, how he had questioned her about the car, and how he just took it without a real explanation. Her mother listened quietly, nodding. When Maya finished telling the story, Mrs. Johnson sighed deeply. "You know, Maya," she began, her voice soft but serious, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened around here." Maya looked at her mother, confused. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath. "I've heard stories from our neighbors. People we know, even friends of yours, have been stopped by that officer before. They'd been treated unfairly too. Some had their cars taken. Some had things said to them that shouldn't have been said. It's a pattern. It's not just one bad day or one bad officer. Maya's heart sank. She had heard whispers in the neighborhood, but she never thought it would happen to her. The more she thought about it, the more it started to make sense. It wasn't just her being unlucky. Officer Roberts had been doing this for a long time. And now she was part of that long list of people who had been treated unfairly. "I don't understand, Mom," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does he treat us like this?" "What did I do?" Her mother reached over and took Maya's hand. "It's not about what you did, honey. It's about who you are. There are people who think they can treat others like this just because of where they come from or what they look like. But you didn't do anything wrong. You're just trying to live your life. And that's what matters." Maya knew her mother was right. But even so, it was hard to shake the feeling of injustice. It wasn't just one officer. It wasn't just one bad situation. This was a bigger problem. And the more Maya thought about it, the more she knew she couldn't let it slide. She had to stand up for herself, even if it meant facing more obstacles. She spent the rest of the evening thinking about what to do next. Maya had always been a quiet person, someone who didn't like making waves. But this wasn't just about her. This was about her community, her friends, and everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by someone in power. She knew she had to do something, even if it was scary. Tomorrow, Maya decided, she would start fighting back. But she didn't know yet how big the battle was going to be. It was only the beginning of what would become a fight for justice. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible or unheard. The next morning, Maya woke up with a clear purpose in her mind. She knew she couldn't just let the situation with Officer Roberts slide. She had to do something about it. The car may have been taken from her, but there was one thing no one could take away: her voice. Maya walked into the kitchen where her mother was already making breakfast. Mrs. Johnson could see the determination in Maya's eyes, and for the first time since the incident, her daughter looked ready to take action. "I'm going to fight this, Mom," Maya said, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm not letting him get away with it." Her mother turned from the stove, a look of concern on her face. "Honey, I know you want to do something, but we have to be careful. This isn't just about getting your car back. It's about bigger things, too. People in power don't always want to listen." Maya nodded. She understood the risks, but this wasn't just about her car anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had experienced. "I'm going to talk to a lawyer," Maya said, feeling more certain with each word. "I know I can't do this alone." After breakfast, Maya and her mother drove to a local law office. Mrs. Johnson was worried, but she trusted her daughter's judgment. They met with a lawyer named Mr. Turner, a calm and knowledgeable man who had helped many people in their community fight for justice. Mr. Turner listened carefully as Maya explained everything that had happened. He didn't interrupt or judge. He took notes, nodding along as she spoke. When Maya finished, he sat back in his chair and looked thoughtful. "You're right to be upset, Maya," he said, "but this is going to take time. Officer Roberts is part of a system. This isn't just about one bad decision. We'll need to gather as much information as we can." Maya felt a mix of hope and anxiety. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to do whatever it took. "What should we do first?" she asked. Mr. Turner gave her a reassuring smile. "First, we gather evidence. You need to get your car's title and registration, any documents that show you are the rightful owner. We'll also want to talk to anyone who saw what happened that day. The more we can prove that your rights were violated, the better." Over the next few days, Maya worked with Mr. Turner to collect all the information they could. She talked to the people who had witnessed the traffic stop, and many of them confirmed that Officer Roberts had acted strangely, almost as if he was looking for a reason to cause trouble. She also got her car's documents in order, making sure everything was ready for the legal fight ahead. It wasn't easy. The process felt slow, and at times, Maya felt frustrated. There were moments when she doubted whether she could keep going. But then, she remembered how much it meant to her to show the world that she wasn't just a victim, but someone who would stand up for herself and others. With each step, Maya felt a little stronger. She knew this was only the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't going to back down. The fight for justice had only just begun. Maya's decision to fight back was starting to gain momentum. With Mr. Turner's help, she gathered her evidence and started to feel more confident, but she knew that it wasn't enough just to have the facts on her side. The issue was bigger than just her case. It was about the treatment of people in her community. She needed to make sure the whole city knew what was happening. One afternoon, Maya sat down with her mother and came up with a plan. They decided to reach out to the local news. The media had a powerful voice, and Maya hoped that sharing her story would help bring attention to the issue. Mrs. Johnson was nervous, but she knew it was the right move. "We can't let this go unnoticed, Mom," Maya said. "If the public hears what happened to me, maybe we can make a real change." After some phone calls, they managed to get an interview with a local journalist, Sarah Matthews. Sarah had been covering community stories for years and was known for her fair and honest reporting. When Maya and her mother arrived at the news station, Sarah greeted them with a warm smile and invited them into a small studio. Maya felt nervous, but Sarah put her at ease with a few kind words. "I just want to know your story," Sarah said, setting up the camera. "Tell me what happened, Maya." Maya took a deep breath and began to explain everything that had happened during the traffic stop. She shared how Officer Roberts had taken her car without explanation, how he had treated her like she was guilty of something without any reason. Maya spoke calmly but firmly, her voice filled with emotion. As she told her story, Maya could see Sarah nodding and taking notes. Sarah asked a few follow-up questions, trying to get more details. Maya answered them all, hoping that the reporter would understand how important this was, not just for her but for everyone in the community. After the interview, Sarah promised that the story would be aired that evening. Maya was nervous but hopeful. She didn't know what would happen, but she was ready to take the next step. As the night went on, Maya couldn't stop thinking about how the community would react. What would people say? Would they support her, or would she be seen as just another person complaining? That evening, when the news broadcast began, Sarah's report came on. Maya and her mother sat together, watching closely. The camera showed Maya standing on the side of the road, her car being towed away. Sarah's voice filled the room, explaining Maya's side of the story. "The young woman claims that the officer had no reason to confiscate her car," Sarah reported. "She says the officer treated her unfairly, despite having all the proper documents to prove ownership." Maya's heart raced as she heard her own words on the screen. It was surreal, but what happened next was even more surprising. The segment didn't just air once, it quickly went viral. People from all over the city shared the video online, commenting on how wrong it was for Maya to be treated that way. Within hours, social media was buzzing with discussions about the story. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #FightForFairness started trending. People who had been through similar experiences shared their stories, and many more voices began to call for change. Maya had no idea that her decision to speak out would spark such a strong response, but it felt like something was finally happening. The story had caught fire, and now Maya was at the center of a movement for fairness. But this was just the beginning. The attention was only going to make the fight more intense, and Maya knew she had to be ready for what was coming next. She had started something much bigger than she had ever expected. As the media coverage of Maya's story spread, so did the questions. People began to ask, how many others had been treated unfairly by Officer Roberts? Was this a one-time mistake, or was there something bigger going on in the Miami Police Department? Maya knew that her fight wasn't just about getting her car back. It was about uncovering the truth, and she was determined to find it. Maya and Mr. Turner, the lawyer who was helping her, started digging deeper into Officer Roberts' past. At first, Maya wasn't sure where to begin. She didn't want to believe that the officer's behavior was part of a bigger problem. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't the first person to have a bad experience with Roberts. Mr. Turner was no stranger to cases of injustice. He had worked on similar cases in the past, and he knew that sometimes the truth wasn't easy to find. But he also knew how important it was to uncover the facts. So, together with Maya, they started contacting other people who might have had encounters with Officer Roberts. It didn't take long before they started hearing the same story over and over again. Maya learned that Officer Roberts had a history of pulling over people of color, often accusing them of things without any real proof. Some people had their cars taken, while others were simply stopped for no reason at all. In each case, Officer Roberts acted with an air of authority, as if he was untouchable. His actions were becoming more and more troubling the deeper they looked. Maya was shocked. She had never imagined that one officer could have such a long history of treating people unfairly. But the more they uncovered, the more Maya realized how much had been hidden from the public. This wasn't just a case of one officer making a mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for years. The next step was to gather as much evidence as they could. Mr. Turner worked to get copies of police records, looking for any mention of Officer Roberts and his interactions with civilians. He also reached out to other lawyers and activists who had worked on similar cases in the past. Slowly but surely, they began to piece together a troubling picture of a system that had failed to hold Officer Roberts accountable for his actions. Maya couldn't believe what she was seeing. The more she learned, the more determined she became. She knew that it wasn't just her fight anymore. It was about everyone who had been unfairly treated. But even as the evidence piled up, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was up against something much bigger than just one officer. This was about the system that allowed him to act with impunity. Maya spent the next few days thinking about what to do next. The truth was coming to light, but it wasn't enough to just expose the officer. Maya needed to make sure that things change, that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. She had to make sure that the community saw the truth and demanded action. Her story had sparked a conversation, and now it was time for her to take the next step. She wasn't going to stop until the system was held accountable. But as she prepared for what was next, Maya realized that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult fight. Maya's case was growing more complicated by the day. After gathering all the evidence, contacting witnesses, and uncovering Officer Roberts' troubling history, Maya was finally ready for the next step: the courtroom. The case was now public, and the attention was intense. It felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. But she was no longer afraid. Maya knew she had the truth on her side, and that gave her the strength to continue. The courtroom was packed when Maya and Mr. Turner walked in. The air was thick with tension. The news cameras were there, reporters ready to capture every moment. Maya could feel all the eyes on her, but she refused to let that stop her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, and she couldn't let that go unnoticed. As Maya took her seat, she noticed Officer Roberts sitting on the other side of the room. He looked calm, almost too calm. Maya couldn't understand how he could sit there with a straight face after everything he had done. But she was determined not to let his presence rattle her. This wasn't about him. It was about justice. Mr. Turner stood up and addressed the court. He explained how Officer Roberts had taken Maya's car without any valid reason, even though she had all the necessary documents proving that the car was hers. He argued that Officer Roberts' actions were part of a pattern of racial bias, a pattern that needed to be stopped. As the trial went on, Maya could see the tension rising in the room. Officer Roberts' lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting that Maya was exaggerating the situation. He tried to paint Maya as someone who just didn't understand the law, claiming that Officer Roberts had done nothing wrong. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had always been taught to respect authority, but hearing the officer's lawyer speak like that made her feel small. Still, she refused to back down. Mr. Turner stood strong beside her, reminding her that this wasn't just a case about her. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated by those in power. The first few days of the trial were exhausting. The courtroom became a place where Maya had to prove that she was right, that Officer Roberts had done something wrong. But as each day passed, more and more people came forward to support her. Witnesses who had seen the traffic stop testified about how they, too, had been treated unfairly by the officer. One by one, the evidence stacked up. Maya couldn't believe how many people had been affected by Officer Roberts' actions. It felt like a weight had been lifted, knowing that others were finally speaking up. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. As the trial continued, the judge seemed to take notice of the growing evidence. The room grew quieter, and Maya felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt before. Maybe, just maybe, things would finally change. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But Maya was more determined than ever to see this through to the end. The court battle was far from over, but Maya had already won something important. She had found her voice. She had shown that standing up for what's right wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. And no matter what happened next, she knew she was on the right path. As the trial continued, Maya felt a growing sense of support from the community. At first, it had just been her and her family, standing up against an officer who seemed untouchable. But as more people heard her story, they began to rally behind her. Maya couldn't believe how many people were now paying attention to her case. It was more than she ever imagined. One evening, as Maya was leaving the courthouse, a small group of people approached her. They were familiar faces, neighbors, family friends, and even people she had seen around town, but never really spoken to. They all had something in common. They had heard about her story, and they wanted to show their support. "We're with you, Maya," one woman, Mrs. Ramirez, said. "We've all been through something like this. You're not alone." Maya smiled, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time. These weren't just words of encouragement. They were from people who truly understood. Mrs. Ramirez wasn't the only one who came forward. More and more people shared their own experiences with Officer Roberts, telling Maya how he had stopped them for no reason or treated them unfairly. Some had been stopped while driving, others while walking down the street. Each person had a story to tell. It became clear to Maya that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her community. She couldn't let this be just a personal battle. It was about making sure everyone was treated fairly and with respect. As the days passed, the support continued to grow. Local activists joined the cause, helping to organize peaceful rallies and protests. People wore T-shirts with slogans like "Justice for Maya" and "Fairness for All." Maya couldn't believe how much attention the story had attracted. What started as a single, unfair traffic stop had sparked a larger conversation about racial justice in their community. The protests were peaceful but powerful. Hundreds of people gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and chanting for change. The crowd's energy was contagious, and Maya felt a sense of pride. She was no longer just an individual standing alone. She was part of something much bigger, something that had the power to create real change. At one of the rallies, a local news station interviewed Maya. She spoke about the importance of standing up for justice and how it felt to have so many people behind her. "This fight isn't just for me," Maya said in the interview. "It's for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly. We need to come together to make sure things like this don't happen again." Her words resonated with many. The story continued to spread across the city and beyond, reaching people who had never met Maya, but felt moved by her courage. The pressure was building, and Maya knew that things were starting to shift. She could feel the weight of the community's support, and it pushed her to keep going, even when the road seemed difficult. The more she saw people coming together, the more she realized the power of community. It wasn't just about legal battles or courtrooms. It was about people who cared enough to make their voices heard and demand change. Maya felt stronger than ever, knowing that she was part of something that could make a real difference. She was no longer fighting alone. The fight for justice was now a shared goal. and she was ready for whatever came next. As Maya's case continued to gather attention, the pressure on the Miami Police Department grew stronger. The public outcry, the protests, the support from her community, everything was pushing for change. But Maya knew that in order to truly make a difference, they needed more than just words. They needed proof. They needed something to force the department to take action. One day, as Maya was reviewing her case files with Mr. Turner, they received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a journalist who had been digging into the internal workings of the Miami Police Department. The journalist had uncovered something shocking, a series of internal memos and reports showing that Officer Roberts had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years. Many of these complaints were about racial profiling and unjust behavior towards civilians. But what was most disturbing was that these reports had been hidden, swept under the rug by the department. "Are you serious?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Yes," the journalist replied. "There's been a pattern here, and it's been ignored for years. But now, the truth is out." The evidence was overwhelming. The police department had known about Officer Roberts' behavior for a long time, but had never taken any action. It was clear that the system had failed, not just Maya, but many others who had been unfairly treated by Roberts. The memos revealed that higher-ups in the department had repeatedly dismissed the complaints, allowing him to continue his harmful actions without consequence. Maya felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was angry. How could the department have allowed this to happen? On the other hand, she felt a sense of relief. The truth was finally coming to light. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated and overlooked. With this new evidence, Maya and Mr. Turner were able to take their case to a whole new level. The media jumped on the story, with news outlets reporting on the newly discovered memos and the department's failure to act. The public outcry intensified, and the pressure on the police department became impossible to ignore. In a surprising move, the Miami Police Department announced that they would be conducting an internal review of Officer Roberts' actions. The review would include an investigation into the complaints that had been filed against him over the years. This was a huge victory for Maya and her supporters. It was the first step toward holding Officer Roberts accountable for his actions. Maya couldn't believe what was happening. She had started this journey feeling small and helpless, but now she was part of something much bigger. The department was finally listening. The wheels of change were beginning to turn. But even with this progress, Maya knew the battle wasn't over. Officer Roberts had been suspended, but that didn't mean the system had been fixed. There was still much work to be done to ensure that the police force was truly serving and protecting everyone, not just certain people. Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to stop until things changed, until everyone was treated fairly, no matter who they were or where they came from. The road ahead would still be tough, but Maya was ready. She had already come so far, and now, with the truth on her side, she knew she could make a difference. The fight for justice was far from over, but Maya was stronger than ever, and the community was with her every step of the way. The day Maya had been waiting for finally arrived. After weeks of hard work, intense media coverage, and an outpouring of support from the community, the court was ready to announce its decision. Maya sat in the courtroom, surrounded by her family and Mr. Turner, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. She had done everything she could to make sure Officer Roberts was held accountable, but the final outcome was still uncertain. The judge stepped into the courtroom, and the room fell silent. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone waited for the verdict. Maya's heart raced, and she couldn't help but wonder, would the court stand up for what was right? Would justice finally be served? After reviewing all the evidence presented in this case, including the testimonies from witnesses and the recent findings regarding Officer Roberts' history of misconduct, the judge began. The court has decided to rule in favor of the plaintiff, Maya Johnson. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she heard those words. She had won. The judge continued, explaining that the police department had failed to properly investigate the officer's actions in the past and that they had violated Maya's rights. Maya's car would be returned to her, and the department would also be required to compensate her for the emotional distress caused by the incident. Tears filled Maya's eyes as she looked at her mother, who was beaming with pride. It wasn't just about the car. It was about something much bigger. Maya had fought for justice, and now she had it. The feeling of victory was sweet, but there was still more to be done. In the days that followed, the Miami Police Department announced that it would be reviewing its policies on how officers handle complaints of misconduct. The department also pledged to implement new training programs aimed at reducing racial bias and improving community relations. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Maya couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short amount of time. Her case had started as a single incident, but it had sparked a conversation about fairness and justice in the community. She had become a symbol of hope for those who had been treated unfairly by the system. But Maya knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won in a single court case or with one decision. It was a fight that would take time, effort, and the collective will of many people. Maya was determined to keep pushing for change, to make sure that no one else would have to go through what she had experienced. As she stood in front of the courthouse that day, Maya felt a sense of pride. She had stood up for what was right, and she had made a difference. But she also knew that the real work was just beginning. She would continue to be a voice for those who needed it most, and she would always fight for a better, fairer world. Maya's journey wasn't just about reclaiming her car. It was about reclaiming her dignity and helping others do the same. She had proven that even one voice could make a difference, and that's a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Justice had been served, but the journey of reform was far from over. Maya was ready for whatever came next. She knew she had the strength, the support, and the courage to keep fighting for a future where everyone was treated fairly. And she wasn't going to stop.